year is 1942. The world is at war, and in the city of Melbourne, Australia, the lights have gone out. All of them. This isn't a power failure. It's a defense, a citywide mandate called the Brownout. Street lights are hooded, windows are draped in black cloth, and car headlights are reduced to tiny shielded slits of light. Every night, a blanket of near-total darkness is pulled over the city, a desperate attempt to make it invisible to the enemy planes that everyone fears are just over the horizon. But when you create a city of shadows, you also create a place for monsters to hide. Into this darkness, America has sent its sons. Thousands of young, handsome GIs, fresh-faced and full of life, a world away from home. They fill the city with a new kind of energy, a mix of swagger, loneliness, and nervous excitement. For the women of Melbourne, they are a welcome distraction from the dread of war. They are charming. They are polite. They are everything you'd want a hero to be. The soldiers are here to protect the city from a foreign enemy. But no one realized the true threat wasn't in the sky. It was already walking their streets. Imagine you're walking home. The air is cool. The silence of the brownout is thick, broken only by your own steps. It's a silence that feels both peaceful and deeply unnerving. You begin to hum a tune, maybe sing softly to yourself. A simple melody to fill the quiet, to remind yourself you're not alone. In the oppressive dark, that small sound is an act of defiance, a flicker of light in a world gone dim. It's a sound of life, a sound of beauty, and then nothing. On the morning of May 3, 1942, in a quiet corner of Albert Park, a discovery is made. A woman's body. Her name is Ivy McLeod. She was 40 years old, a wife, on her way home from her job at a small lending library. The police arrive. They analyze the scene. They search for clues, but nothing makes sense. Her purse hasn't been touched. She hasn't been robbed. The coroner's report confirms she was not sexually assaulted. There is no evidence of a struggle, no witnesses, no weapon. There is only the quiet, brutal finality of the act itself. The official cause of death is murder by strangulation. To the investigators, it's a crime without a story, a killing without a motive. It's a ghost. A whisper of violence that appeared out of the wartime gloom and vanished without a trace. The newspapers report the facts, and a wave of fear, cold and sharp, begins to creep through the city. Women are warned not to walk alone. The brownout, once a symbol of safety, now feels like a hunting ground. A killer was now loose in their city, a shadow in the darkness. The hunt was on. But what the city didn't know, what the police couldn't possibly comprehend, was that they weren't just looking for a man. They were looking for a monster created by the war itself. A predator who stalked the darkness, hunting for one thing: a beautiful voice. To understand the monster, you first have to understand the man. And the man at his core was broken long before he ever saw a battlefield. His name was Edward Joseph Leonsky, born in New Jersey to a family drowning in alcohol and violence. His mother was a heavy drinker. His father was a drunk who beat him. From this poison, a boy grew up with a simmering rage and a deep, unnerving emptiness. Before he ever put on a uniform, he was known for two things: an incredible capacity for liquor, and a switch that would flip in his mind, turning him from a smiling friend into something cold and violent. He was the dry kindling, a pile of psychological wreckage just waiting for a spark. And the Second World War was about to provide a firestorm. When Private Leonsky arrived in Melbourne, he wasn't a monster. He was a savior. At least that's how he seemed. He was tall, handsome, with an easy smile that put everyone at ease. His fellow soldiers called him Buddy. And the name fit. He was everyone's friend, the life of the party, a charming American GI who could make any girl laugh. In a city starved for good news and a sense of normalcy, he was a welcome sight. He was hiding not in the shadows of the brownout, but in the bright, blinding light of his own charisma. The city itself became his accomplice. The war had turned Melbourne into a place of chaos and anonymity. Thousands of soldiers far from home with no one to hold them accountable. Social rules were bent, And for a man like Liansky, they were broken entirely. The darkness of the brownout gave him cover, but the chaos of the war gave him something far more valuable: permission. It was the perfect storm. A broken man, in a broken time, in a city shrouded in darkness. And in that storm, he found his first victim. We return to the murder of Ivy McLeod, but this time we see it through his eyes pieced together from the chillingly calm words of his own confession. He saw her walking home from the library that night. He heard her singing. And in his fractured mind, that sound wasn't just beautiful. It was something to be possessed. An obsession took hold. He didn't want her money. He didn't want her body. He wanted her voice. To satisfy this obsessive compulsion, this psychosis, Liansky implemented his horrifying process. He followed her, and when the moment was right, he murdered Ivy McLeod by strangulation. He believed that in the final violent act of squeezing the life from her, he could capture her voice, steal it, and make it his own. After the murder of Ivy McLeod, a quiet dread settled over Melbourne. For 6 days, the city held its breath, hoping it was an isolated act of violence, a tragic but random horror. Life, under the strange new rules of war and darkness, had to go on. But the killer was not finished. The compulsion that had taken root in his mind was now growing, demanding to be fed again. His next target was Pauline Thompson. She was 31 years old, a woman simply trying to navigate the changed landscape of her city. On the evening of May 9th, she'd been out to dinner and was waiting for a tram to take her home. It was late. The streets were dark and mostly empty. That's when she met a charming American soldier. He was polite, good-looking, and offered to walk with her. In a city gripped by fear, the offer of protection from a man in uniform must have felt like a relief. She wouldn't have known she was walking beside the very thing she should have been running from. He saw her laughing with a friend. He heard the sound of her voice. And in the shadows of a quiet street near the Treasury Gardens, the same dark compulsion took hold. He didn't want her money. He didn't want to assault her. He wanted the sound she made. Using the same horrifying methodology, he murdered Pauline Thompson by strangulation, convinced he was capturing her voice for his collection. When her body was discovered, the quiet dread in Melbourne erupted into full-blown panic. 2 women, murdered in the same way, in less than a week. The newspapers gave the killer a name that would be whispered in every home: the Brownout Strangler. Fear was now a tangible thing. Every American GI became a potential suspect. The easy trust between the visiting soldiers and the local population began to fray, replaced by suspicion and paranoia. The charming saviors in uniform now looked like a potential threat, and the city that had once welcomed them began to lock its doors. The killer, however, felt no fear. He felt emboldened. The chaos he was creating was another shadow for him to hide in. He was a part of the 52nd Signal Battalion, stationed at Camp Pell in Royal Park. He was a soldier, surrounded by thousands of other soldiers. He was a needle in a haystack. 9 days after he murdered Pauline Thompson, on May 18th, this feeling of invisibility drove him to his most brazen act yet. His third victim was Gladys Hosking. She was 40 years old, a tutor and advisor at the University of Melbourne's Women's College. She was a respected, intelligent woman, walking home from the university library. That night, Private Edward Liansky was on guard duty at Camp Pell. He was supposed to be protecting the base. Instead, under the cover of darkness, he slipped away from his post. He found Gladys Hosking on a quiet path in the sprawling Royal Park just outside his camp. He talked with her, charmed her, and then, driven by the same psychosis, he murdered her. He dragged her body near the gates of his own military base and left her there. Then he did something truly chilling. He wiped the mud from his boots, straightened his uniform, and returned to his post to finish his shift. He was a killer who clocked in and clocked out, but this time, he had made mistakes. The terror he had unleashed had put every police officer and military investigator on high alert. The hunt for the Brownout Strangler was now the city's single-minded obsession. and two small, seemingly insignificant details would bring Leonsky's reign of terror to an end. The first was a voice, not one he was trying to steal, but one that would speak against him. A fellow American soldier, Private Anthony Gallo, came forward. He told investigators a chilling story. On the night Pauline Thompson was murdered, he had been drinking with a buddy from his unit. That buddy was Private Edward Leonsky. Gallo remembered seeing Leonsky talking with Pauline, saw them walk away together into the darkness. He was the last person to see her alive besides her killer. When the military police put together a lineup, Private Gallo looked down the line of soldiers, and his finger landed on one man. There was no doubt in his mind. It was Buddy Leonsky. The second clue was the earth itself. The ground in Royal Park where Gladys Hosking's body was found was a specific type of yellow clay, turned to thick mud by recent rains. When investigators searched Leonsky's tent, they found his uniform from the night of the murder. It was covered in that same distinctive mud. Samples were rushed to geologists and scientists at the University of Melbourne. They compared the soil from the crime scene to the soil caked onto Leonsky's uniform. The result was a perfect match. It was a forensic link that placed him at the scene of the crime, on the night of the murder. The charming smile, the friendly nickname. It was all a mask, and it was now being ripped away. The eyewitness placed him with one victim. The mud on his uniform placed him with another. The net had closed. The Brownout Strangler had a name, and it was Private Edward Leonsky. With Edward Leonsky in custody, a collective sigh of relief swept across Melbourne. The Brownout Strangler was caught. The terror was over. But the story was just beginning. The arrest of the charming American GI wasn't an end, it was a beginning. A beginning of a legal and psychological drama that would unfold under the watching eyes of two allied nations, America and Australia. A drama that would raise a question far more disturbing than who did it. The real question was, what was he? Was he a cold, calculating killer? Or was he something else entirely? A man whose mind had been shattered by the pressures of war, a man in the grip of a psychosis he couldn't control. The answer would begin to surface in a sterile interrogation room. There was no struggle, no denial, no desperate plea of innocence. Leonsky simply sat down and talked. He confessed to everything, calmly, matter-of-factly, as if he were describing a trip to the store. He recounted the murders of Ivy McLeod, Pauline Thompson, and Gladys Hosking in chilling detail. He explained his motive with a terrifying simplicity. He wanted their voices. He told the investigators that when he heard a woman's voice that he liked, he felt an uncontrollable urge to get it. He believed that by strangling them, he could capture their voices and keep them for himself. It was a confession that offered no remorse, no regret, only a glimpse into a mind that had become terrifyingly detached from reality. On July 6, 1942, an unprecedented event took place in Melbourne. For the first time in Australian history, a foreign military tribunal was convened on its soil. This was not a trial for an Australian citizen in an Australian court. This was a United States Army court-martial held in the Allied territory of Australia. The fate of Private Edward Leonsky would be decided by a panel of American officers under American military law. The charge was murder, 3 counts. The evidence was overwhelming. The confession, the eyewitness, the mud on his uniform. There was no doubt that he had committed the acts. The trial, therefore, would not be a fight over the facts. It would be a battle for his mind. The prosecution, led by the U.S. Army, presented a clear and simple case. Private Leonsky was sane. He was a man with a psychopathic personality, prone to emotional conflicts and violent outbursts, especially when drinking, but he was not insane. He knew the difference between right and wrong. He understood the nature of his actions. He was a predator who had used the cover of war to indulge his darkest impulses. To the prosecution, this was a case of pure, unadulterated evil, an evil that needed to be punished. But the defense painted a very different picture. They argued that the man who had charmed his way through Melbourne, the man his friends called Buddy, was not the same man who had committed these monstrous acts. They presented evidence of a dual personality. They described a man who would go into a trance-like state, a man who would wake up from his violent episodes with no memory of what he had done. They argued that he was not in control of his actions, that he was in the grip of a severe psychosis, a mental storm that had been raging in his mind since childhood, and had finally been unleashed by the pressures of war. They argued that he was not a monster to be executed, but a sick man to be treated. The verdict, when it came, was swift. The panel of American officers took just over 2 hours to reach their decision. Guilty, on all 3 counts of murder. The sentence was just as swift, death by hanging. The charming GI who had arrived in Melbourne as a hero was now a condemned killer. But the story didn't end there. Under American military law, a death sentence had to be reviewed. First by the commanding general, Douglas MacArthur, and then by the President of the United States himself, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Liansky's case traveled up the chain of command, a final, desperate plea for his life. But in a world at war, there was little room for mercy. MacArthur confirmed the sentence. Roosevelt, half a world away, did the same. The legal battle was over. The date was set. Private Edward Liansky, the singing strangler of Melbourne, would be the first American soldier to be executed for murder in Australia since the beginning of the war. On November 9, 1942, just before dawn, Private Edward Liansky was led from his cell in Melbourne's Pentridge prison. The legal battles were over. The appeals were exhausted. This was the end. He walked calmly to the gallows, a man seemingly at peace with his fate. He was asked if he had any last words. He didn't speak of regret or of God or of the families he had shattered. He simply said, "I'd like to have some beer." A final, chilling glimpse into a mind that remained a mystery until the very end. At 6 a.m., the trapdoor opened. The singing strangler was silenced. Justice, swift and absolute, had been delivered. For the city of Melbourne, the nightmare was finally over. The brownout would continue. The war would rage on. But the specific terror that had gripped their streets was gone. The story of Edward Liansky could now be closed, filed away as a dark but finished chapter in the city's history. But the end of a life is not always the end of the story. And the questions raised by the case of the singing strangler did not die with him on the gallows. Was he simply a monster? A bad seed who used the chaos of war as his personal playground? Or was he something more complex, something more terrifying? Was he a casualty of a different kind of war? A war of the mind? A man whose latent psychosis, the dry kindling of his violent upbringing, was ignited by the immense psychological pressures of being a soldier far from home, in a city shrouded in darkness and anonymity. The court-martial declared him sane. But the question echoes long after the verdict. The war created the perfect environment for a predator like Liansky to thrive. The darkness gave him cover. The chaos gave him anonymity. The constant underlying stress and violence of a world at war may have been the final push that shattered his already fragile mind. He was a product of his time, a dark reflection of the chaos that surrounded him. We create soldiers to fight our wars. We train them for violence. We send them into the crucible of conflict. But we rarely talk about what the crucible can do to them. The singing strangler was silenced, but his story serves as a horrifying reminder that the loudest screams of war are not always on the battlefield. Sometimes they are in the minds of the men we create to fight them. And the most terrifying question is not what Edward Liansky did, but how many more like him are forged in the fires of conflict. Their psychosis a sound that no one ever hears, until it's too late. That's the end of today's story, but the conversation is just beginning. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read as many as I can. If you enjoy content that goes beyond the headlines, consider subscribing and joining our community of curious minds. Your support truly helps the channel grow. See you next time.